So the first thing to understand is that the chemistry of the Earth is split into 4 major subgroups. So you've got the lithosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. So these are the 4 major subgroups of matter that we see in the Earth. And we'll go through what each of these are as we go through this lesson. So the lithosphere is essentially any mineral component that we see on the Earth. So the lithosphere is composed of the Earth's crust and the upper mantle. If we imagine the Earth, you've got the core in the very middle, which is very dense, and then you've got the mantle, which is liquid, and then you've got the crust on the outside. The lithosphere kind of only takes up the crust and the top part of the mantle. So all of this red section would be the lithosphere. So that's what it is. It's just the crust and the upper part of the mantle. So the lithosphere is any section of the Earth that deforms over an extremely long time period. So another way of looking at it is, imagine that you have rock, and the rock on the Earth is moving, but very, very slowly. And when it collides with other rocks, it deforms. We can consider any of the lithosphere to be any part of the Earth that deforms over immensely long periods of time. Now, what it's composed of is mainly metal silicates, as well as aluminium oxide, iron oxide, calcium carbonate, and sodium chloride. So it's mostly composed of metal silicates, but there are other chemicals like these scattered around. They exist as underground deposits, rocks, and soils. Okay, so the lithosphere exists as underground deposits of rock, soil, other types of rocks that we see on above the ground. The hydrosphere is any non-living body of water, such as a lake, river, or ocean, and the composition varies depending on the location. Freshwater, so no salt in the water, freshwater, is an extremely limited resource, particularly on this planet, where we have mostly salt water. Most of the hydrosphere is saltwater because of the ocean, so it's about 97.4% saltwater. Rivers, lakes, reservoirs, soils, and living organisms account for 0.02% of the freshwater on the Earth. Some of the water is as frozen ice in certain areas, called permafrost, and that's about 2%. And the remaining part is stored underground in aquifers. Alice Springs runs on very large water aquifer under the ground, so that's where they get their water from. The breakdown of chemicals in the hydrosphere are as follows. You've got salt, different types of salts. So KCl, potassium chloride, is 2.8% in the hydrosphere. Potassium sulfate is again 2.8% in the hydrosphere. Magnesium sulfate is much more, it's 5.5%. Magnesium chloride is even higher than that, 10.4%. And sodium chloride, salt, takes up the biggest percentage, and that's 78.5%. More than 3/4 of the salt in the hydrosphere is NaCl. The atmosphere. Gaseous components of the Earth's surface. So that's what they are. They're the gas parts of the Earth. So that was what the atmosphere is. I'm sure we've seen the atmosphere before. So it's any sort of gas that we see in the just surrounding the Earth's surface. The atmosphere helps to store and transport oxygen, nitrogen, and water vapor, as well as carbon dioxide, which are all used in special cycles. So oxygen is used in our respiratory cycle, as well as the photosynthetic cycle. Water is used in, obviously, the water cycle. Nitrogen has its own cycle called the nitrogen cycle. And carbon has its own cycle called the carbon cycle. Okay, so all of these are involved in cycle, and the atmosphere helps to move them around to places that can actually utilize them. So the chemical composition of the atmosphere is fairly constant, but it does vary from place to place, but not by much. So nitrogen makes up the most, about 78.1%. Oxygen is about 21% almost. Argon is 0.9% of a percent. Carbon dioxide is 0.04 of a percent. And the remaining part is just 0.01% of whatever else is there. Helium, hydrogen, and other trace gases. So very, very little of other gases. Main ones are nitrogen and oxygen. Lastly, the biosphere. The only sphere that contains living organisms. This is the only sphere that contains the living part of the Earth. So it extends from anywhere between 8 to 10 kilometers above sea level to a few meters below the soil, so a few meters down into the soil. So life in water occurs at various depths up to about 3 kilometers down. Life can still exist 3 kilometers underneath the surface of the water. And in the biosphere, there's an interaction between life and the material from the other 3 non-living zones. So the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. So for instance, me as a human, I go and breathe air from the atmosphere. I plant my crops in the lithosphere, and then I go and extract water from the hydrosphere for me to drink. So you can see that I'm interacting with all 3 of the spheres just by living. Similarly, other organisms do other things. So for instance, bacteria that live in the soil live off the nutrients in the soil, the lithosphere. They absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they absorb water, obviously, from the hydrosphere. Okay, so you can see that all these interactions happen between all 4 of the spheres. Okay, so that concludes today's lesson on the 4 spheres of the Earth. So we looked at the biosphere, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere, and we've looked at what they're actually made out of. So move on to the question segment now.